Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. My name is Brian Allman. Remember to visit gemstatechronicle.com for all my work, as well as new guest editorials almost every day. I've also been publishing letters to the editor on Wednesdays, in addition to all my candidate interviews with people who are running for the legislature this year. Subscribe for free or support my work at gemstate.substack.com, and don't forget to visit this month's sponsor, which is iloveidaho.org, for a conservative voter's guide for this month's primary election. Now that's iluvidaho.org. Our friends over in the Gem State Conservatives, Tom, Trent, Tyler, and their crew, have apparently registered a different spelling of that same phrase to confuse people. It's absolutely dastardly. Today, I want to talk about how we on the right shape our messaging. Politics is all about communication, and how we communicate will determine whether or not voters listen to our ideas or tune us out. The bedrock of communication is credibility. Do our words carry weight? Credibility is an important part of politics, for better or for worse. If voters are presented with a well-spoken candidate who sounds like he knows what he's talking about, versus someone who comes across as a raving lunatic, they'll generally go with the first option, even if that raving lunatic turns out to have been right. In this era of extreme political polarization, it's tempting to take things to 11, as Nigel Tufnell would say. After all, that's been the left's modus operandi for a long time. Joe Biden said that Mitt Romney was going to put black people back in chains. Hillary Clinton said that Donald Trump was a Russian spy, and that lie has been repeated and taken seriously by left-wing media ever since. They told us that anyone not taking the COVID vaccine would face a winter of severe illness and death. Since the leftists who parrot these lines don't seem to have faced any consequences, you can see why conservatives might think that that's just how we talk about things now. That's a mistake, because whether we like it or not, we're judged more harshly on our rhetoric. We have a hostile media environment which can and will use anything we say against us. That doesn't mean we compromise on the truth, but we must be careful how we phrase things, how we communicate. Our side loses credibility when we talk about secret servers changing vote tallies, even in counties that don't use machines. That makes it easy for the media to dismiss all claims of election irregularities, even those that we know are true, like excessive ballot harvesting and lack of signature verification. We lose credibility when we demand Nuremberg-style tribunals for those involved with COVID, whether the researchers who probably created the disease in a lab or the petty bureaucrats who shut down our churches and our businesses. Regular people don't want to think about COVID anymore, much less consider the sort of justice that was enacted against defeated Nazis. We lose credibility when we predict that every single person who took a COVID shot is going to be dead in however many years. According to the CDC, 64% of Idahoans took at least one shot. Do you really expect people to believe that 1.1 million people in the state are going to drop dead in the next couple of years? Obviously, there have been greater than usual side effects to this particular shot. Even mainstream media is catching up to that. But these outlandish predictions only cause regular people to dismiss you as a kook, and then they shut their ears to anything else you might have to say. Things that might play well in a small group of like-minded people often do not in the greater discourse. You see, one of the biggest components of credibility is making sure that your rhetoric matches people's experience. Things that sound ordinary in your small gathering of like-minded people, they often sound completely foreign to folks outside that bubble. You see, people in bubbles are primed to accept and even cheer things that might sound ridiculous in other contexts. Most Idahoans have taken at least one COVID shot, and most of them are fine. So if you tell them that they're inevitably going to die, aren't we all, then they see incongruity between your words and their experience. And that causes them to tune you out. Trent Clark mentioned something to me the other day that I've been mulling over. Now, obviously, he's wrong about a lot of things. Speaking of credibility, he repeats things that sound reasonable to his bubble, like Dorothy Moon is Stalin and the Idaho GOP is the Gestapo. I think normal people find that pretty off-putting as well. In any case, he pointed out that conservatives in Bonneville County made a mistake when they went after Senator Kevin Cook as a liberal and a rhino, because it ran contrary to the impressions and experiences of the voters. To most people, he comes across as a good man, a conservative, a pillar of the church, which makes those accusations fall flat and turns them around on the people making them. I think there is something to this. Most voters don't dig too deeply into a legislator's record. Rather, they go by their general feelings. Having had a conversation with Senator Cook, I found him to be a normal guy with generally conservative views. Now, I still disagree with a lot of his votes and his specific policy positions, but we were able to have a conversation. Add that to the unity and respect that he has within the LDS community, and you can see how going after someone like him is a losing proposition. Does that mean it's impossible to challenge someone in such a position? Of course not. But you have to do it carefully and from a position of credibility. First, we have to stop calling everyone rhinos. As I've said before, there are people within our ranks who are genuinely Republicans in name only. Take someone like former State Senator Patty Ann Lodge, who endorsed the Democrat candidate for Attorney General rather than hold her nose and support Raul Labrador, who was nominated by the voters. Former State Senator Fred Martin falls into that category as well. When Cody Galloway defeated him in the primary, instead of supporting her, he campaigned for the Democrat, who ended up winning by about 300 votes. He also supported the Democrat for AG, which is par for the course by now. Those are real rhinos. They clearly don't believe in Republican principles, and they probably don't have a conservative bone in their bodies. They're political opportunists at best, leftist infiltrators at worst. I'm sure there are others like that within the Republican Party, but when you start calling anyone whose Freedom Index scores below 85% a rhino, then guess what? You lose credibility. People tune you out. People don't listen to what you have to say anymore. You also need to consider your audience. What works in one context often doesn't work in another. Voters in North Idaho care about the Freedom Index, for example. They care about cutting the state budget. They care about these social issues. Emphasizing your own bona fides on those metrics is a way to gain credibility in the Panhandle. However, that same message will likely backfire in eastern Idaho. For one reason or another, voters over there don't embrace the Freedom Index. In fact, many see a low score as a positive thing. They've bought into the idea that the Idaho Freedom Foundation is the enemy. They see government spending as somewhere between a necessary evil and even an outright benefit. So how do you communicate with those people without abandoning your principles? The answer, as best as I can figure out, is to change your message, but not your ideals. Communicate a conservative message with a moderate tone. Meet people where they are without insulting their friends, neighbors, and community leaders. You see, the Republican Party has never been ideologically monolithic. We do ourselves a disservice by defining a single moment in time or a single issue as the end-all be-all of Republican values. When the GOP was founded in 1854, it was decidedly progressive. Maintaining slavery was the conservative position at the time. At the turn of the 20th century, the GOP had adopted many of the progressive policies that even the Democrats found to be a bridge too far, such as trust busting and worker protections. Grover Cleveland, who served 2 non-consecutive terms at the end of the 19th century, was a conservative Democrat, while Teddy Roosevelt, who served a term and a half at the start of the 20th century, was a progressive Republican. In fact, it used to be normal to have progressive Republicans and conservative Democrats. Former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller was a liberal Republican who supported abortion and government spending, while former Texas Governor John Connally was a conservative Democrat who eventually joined the GOP after working closely with Richard Nixon. Isn't that funny that we used to have Republicans governing New York and Democrats governing Texas? That shows us 2 things. First, political realignments can happen fast, before you know it. And second, people rapidly get used to the new normal and forget that it was ever different. They think it's always been this way. I'm old enough to remember George W. Bush defeating Ann Richards, the last Democrat to govern Texas, in 1994. Yet today it feels like Texas has just always been Republican. This tendency to lose historical perspective is another way we lose credibility with our rhetoric, because we talk as if things have always been the way they are now, and that they always will be. For example, we consider Idaho a red state, even if many of us recognize that it's not necessarily conservative. Yet just a few years ago, we had a Democrat governor, Cecil Andrus, a Democratic senator, Frank Church, and a Democrat attorney general, Larry Echohawk. The latter was LDS, which blurs the lines even more, doesn't it? We've also, of course, had Republican elected officials whose ideology was much more liberal, such as Jim Jones and Ben Isursa. When people talk about Idaho values, consider they might be thinking of the policies of Church and Andrus rather than anything remotely conservative. When people switch parties, it's for, I think, one of three reasons. Either their own positions have changed and they move to a party that better reflects their views, or the party changes so they find themselves more at home elsewhere. The third possibility is that it's simply a coldly strategic move to win election, which obviously that's not unheard of either. The first two, they resemble each other. It's hard to figure out which is which. Consider, say, Naomi Wolf. She's an uber-feminist who's always had very left-wing views, but her skepticism of vaccines got her essentially expelled from the left, and so she found refuge on the right, becoming a mainstay on Steve Bannon's show. Did she actually change her mind on all the other issues that distinguish Republicans from Democrats? Converts often try to make room in their new party for their old views. If a, say, homosexual Democrat switches parties because he doesn't believe in the trans stuff, he's still likely to try and push for more acceptance and support of homosexuality within the GOP, thus pushing the party leftward anyway. The so-called neoconservatives took over the GOP in the 60s and 70s because it was where they could best express their anti-communist and interventionist views. They weren't necessarily socially conservative, but they adopted socially conservative positions in order to maintain support from the Christian base of the Republican Party. When Donald Trump came along, rejecting neoconservative positions like free trade and foreign military adventures, they very quickly discarded social conservatism, as quickly as you kick off a pair of shoes. You see, they never truly held those positions, rather they pretended to because it was politically expedient. All that's to say that the lines between Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative, have never been super clearly defined. They've always been vague and blurry. But today, we are seeing a lot more political polarization. There's no such thing as a conservative Democrat anymore. There hasn't been since Brandon Durst joined the Idaho GOP. Yet there are still moderate and even liberal Republicans. The question for us now is, how do we address this situation without losing our credibility? The first thing is we have to know ourselves. What does it mean to be conservative? What are the core positions of the Idaho Republican Party? Now, you can say it means adhering to the platform, but that changes every 2 years, and it's going to change again in Coeur d'Alene next month. We have to go deeper. What are the principles upon which our platform rests? What are the principles that unify the Republican cause from Lincoln to Roosevelt to Reagan to Trump? If you can't comprehensively explain your own positions and where your own beliefs come from, how can you expect to convince the voters to support you? The second thing we must do is know our enemies, or at least our ideological opponents. Can you articulate your opponent's view of things? One of the best ways to sharpen your own positions is to debate against them. Can you explain why someone like Kevin Cook votes the way he does? One of the biggest ways we lose credibility is by simply calling our opponents evil or stupid. They're just rhinos. They're trying to turn Idaho blue. They're leftists, socialists. They're basically Antifa. That's a good way to ensure that voters never listen to a thing you have to say. One of the best ways to understand your opponent's position is simply to have honest conversations. Instead of looking for a gotcha moment, just listen. It's not a betrayal of your principles to calmly hear out a disagreeing view. Too often, we treat our positions as fragile little flowers, needing to be locked away in glass lest a strong wind blow them away. No. If you really believe in what you say you believe, then you're not afraid to expose yourself to disagreements and criticism. Iron sharpens iron. I want to hear the strongest arguments against my positions, not the weakest. Either I'll learn to strengthen my own arguments, or maybe I might admit I was wrong on some point or two. Either way, my pursuit of the truth is only helped by exposure to disagreement. We gain credibility when we debate the other side's strongest arguments, rather than ignoring them, evading them, or just calling names. If you want to debate Senator Cook, do it on the issues. Explain why the launch grant is a bad idea. Explain why money should follow the student. Explain why a cell phone filter bill is unfeasible, or why mandating insurance providers reimburse 6 months of contraception at a time is not the proper role of government. Communicating these ideas to voters is more difficult than just calling your opponent a liberal or a rhino, but it will be far more effective, and you'll maintain your credibility so that voters won't tune you out on other issues as well. The easy path leads to political isolation. Eventually, everyone is a rhino. Everyone but you is a liberal infiltrator. But the hard path leads to a broad-based movement that can achieve political success. Remember, I'm not saying compromise your principles. This is about communication, how to message those principles. Why do so many people remember Ronald Reagan so fondly today? Is it because of his policies? Quick, name one. Okay, tax cuts. Sure, name another. Now think of your favorite Reagan quote. I'll bet there are dozens that come to mind right away. People loved Reagan because he was a great communicator. Communication must precede policy. If you can speak to people's hearts, they will be open to hearing your policies. But if your style of communication leaves a bad taste in their mouths, they'll reject your positions without a second thought, no matter how correct your positions happen to be. In 1992, the great conservative Patrick Buchanan gave one of what I think is the greatest speeches in American history at the Republican National Convention in Houston. Rather than letting then-President George H.W. Bush, a moderate Republican compared to Ronald Reagan, be renominated without opposition, Buchanan bravely challenged the sitting president with a message of social conservatism and an appeal to the working class that had so long been stalwart Democrats. Buchanan's campaign was a precursor to that of Donald Trump 24 years later. Yet when the Republican voters chose Bush, Buchanan did his duty. He supported the nominee, explaining that Bill Clinton and the Democrats were the real enemies. But you know what? Nobody remembers Bush's acceptance speech that night in Houston. But Buchanan's exhortation to remember the people echoes through history. He saw a path for conservative values and principles that could be communicated with credibility to the normal voters of America. Voters who were seeing their country beginning to decay, to deteriorate, to fall apart in the wake of our victory in the Cold War. I invite you to listen to his words and consider them today, and think about what it means to communicate a conservative message in a tone that opens people's hearts and minds.
Friends, this election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side. And so to the Buchanan brigades out there, we have to come home and stand beside George Bush. In these 6 months of campaigning from Concord, New Hampshire to California, I came to know our country better than I have known it ever before in my life. And I gathered up memories that are going to be with me the rest of my days. It was that day-long ride through the great state of Georgia in a bus Vice President Bush himself had used in 1988 called Asphalt One. The ride ended in a 9 p.m. speech in a tiny town in southern Georgia called Fitzgerald. There were those workers at the James River paper mill in northern New Hampshire in a town called Groveton. Tough, hardy men. None of them would say a word to me as I came down the line, shaking their hands one by one. They were under threat of losing their jobs at Christmas. And as I moved down the line, one tough fellow about my age just looked up and said to me, "Save our jobs." Then there was the legal secretary that I met at the Manchester airport on Christmas Day, who came running up to me and said, "Mr. Buchanan, I'm going to vote for you." And then she broke down weeping, and she said, "I've lost my job, I don't have any money, and they're going to take away my little girl. What am I going to do?" My friends, these people are our people. They don't read Adam Smith or Edmund Burke, but they come from the same schoolyards and the same playgrounds and towns as we came from. They share our beliefs and our convictions, our hopes and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people, and we need to reconnect with them. We need to let them know we know how bad they're hurting. They don't expect miracles of us, but they need to know we care.
This has been the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. My name is Brian Allman. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again next time.